Imagine if you were trapped on a small island, hiding just inches away from the enemy, counting the days as they went by, waiting to be rescued. Well, on December 7th, 1941, as the Japanese were attacking Pearl Harbor, they were also bombing a tiny island in the Pacific Ocean where an American base was under construction. And this is where our story begins. Wake Island, a tiny coral atoll, less than 3 square miles in size, was sought after by the Japanese for its airfield and strategic location in the Central Pacific. Along with 500 American military personnel, the island was also occupied by 1,200 civilian contractors who were expected to assist in the island's defense. But when the bombs began to drop, most opted to take cover in small foxholes in the low brush, which only covered about 10% of the island. And it was there that they would store their supplies and caches of food to wait out the attacks. The first bombing resulted in over 150 American casualties, and most of the island's squadron of Wildcat fighter aircraft were destroyed. But then, on December 11th, 1941, a large fleet of Japanese warships emerged off the coast. An invasion was imminent. The men quickly scrambled to their positions. Commander Winfield Cunningham ordered gunners to hold their fire until the enemy moved within close range. Then, the coastal batteries opened fire, sinking Japanese warships with deadly precision. The Japanese panicked, withdrew their landing forces, and were handed the first defeat of the war. But the daily bombings continued, and on December 23, 1941, Japanese Marines stormed the island and overwhelmed the garrison. The Japanese paid a heavy price for the island. 1,100 casualties, 5 ships sunk, and 21 planes were destroyed. The Americans also suffered losses, 120 killed, 49 wounded, and over 1,500 taken prisoner. But 2 American civilians were reported as missing in action: Logan Scotty K and Fred Stevens. On the day of the invasion, Fred and Scotty looked out as they took cover, and they were stunned to see 500 American POWs herded past them by Japanese forces. The worst had happened. The Americans had lost, and the 2 were now trapped on an enemy-occupied island with limited supplies. But at that moment, they decided that they would take any and all measures to avoid capture. That night, a Japanese soldier on patrol came within 5 feet of their dugout. As the men lay breathless, suddenly the sentry was distracted and quickly headed off in another direction, becoming the first of many close calls. On Christmas Eve, the men headed for the brush to obtain better cover. They knew there were 1,000 foxholes full of food and water. But so did the Japanese, and it was a race against time to collect as much food as possible before it was confiscated. They waited until complete darkness before crawling on their hands and knees towards one of the food dugouts. But they found something else instead. The 2 men had stumbled upon a Japanese gun emplacement. As luck would have it, the soldiers were asleep. They quickly crawled back into the brush and remained there until the next night. You see, Fred and Scotty just couldn't walk out in broad daylight. They'd get caught. They could only move around at night or during a tropical rainstorm. As the nights passed, they discovered cans of food in the abandoned foxholes, burying them so no one else could find it. The 2 men were marooned on a desert island surrounded by hostiles. On the evening of December 28th, 3 soldiers stumbled near their foxhole less than 10 feet away. They heard the crack of a branch. Fred and Scotty froze. The patrol paused and listened, and then continued down the path. They couldn't remain in one spot for more than a few hours, so they created multiple hideouts around the island. They made decoy paths away from their lairs to fool the sentries. It was a dangerous game of hide and seek they were playing, always having to stay one step ahead of the enemy. The days passed by slowly. The men would lay patiently on their backs and watch birds and enemy aircraft fly overhead. They were waiting for the American invasion force for their liberation. But where were they? They should have been here by now. To keep their spirits up, Scotty continued to record each day of their holdout in a journal. Fred read whatever books he could find. They played cards together and had pet lizards that kept away the biting bugs. After a heavy rainfall one evening, they heard Japanese soldiers approaching. Fred and Scotty were standing out in the open, and they dove into some brush. The soldiers strode by within inches as the terrified men held their breath. After the close call, Scotty and Fred crawled back to their dugout, dodging captivity once again. The island was now overcrowded with 3,000 Japanese soldiers moving in all directions day and night. Off in the distance, Fred and Scotty heard the voices of American POWs who were forced into labor. The enemy continued their reconstruction, with heavy bulldozers pushing piles of debris right up to the edge of their camp and blasting, sending rocks hurtling down all around them. The walls were closing in. Fred and Scotty were surrounded. The situation seemed hopeless. They were running out of food and suffering from malnutrition, but just as the situation seemed to be at its worst, they stumbled upon an oasis, a Chinese labor camp filled with food. They took small amounts of potatoes, corn, and grapes so their raids would go unnoticed. Despite the close encounters and the disappointment that the American invasion had not yet taken place, their hope began to grow. But Fred began to get on Scotty's nerves. He ate large portions of the limited food supply. He snored loudly, and he'd break wind at the most inopportune times, almost giving away their position. By February, the tropical weather was turning cold and wet, and all the men had was the tattered clothing on their backs. They had to move from their hideouts up to 4 times a day now in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Late in February, activity on the island began to increase. The Japanese were sending up aircraft at all hours and conducting non-stop firing practice. Something was up. Were the Americans finally coming to liberate Wake Island? 2 days later, they thought their prayers were finally answered. An American fleet sat off the coast and began shelling the island. Fred and Scotty climbed a tree to watch the heavy barrage and cheered them on by waving white handkerchiefs. But by 4:30 in the afternoon, the bombardment had ceased and all went quiet. That's it? Where's the invasion force? The Americans had turned back. The next day, a guard came out of nowhere and headed straight towards them. Fred was standing near a tree and dove into a thicket where Scotty was hiding. The soldier must have heard them because it seemed that he was staring directly into their eyes. They had managed to evade their hunters for over 2 months, but now their luck had run out. They closed their eyes, expecting to hear the final sound of their lives, the click of a trigger. But it never came. Instead, they heard a loud command from across the lagoon, and the soldier scurried off. After the scare, Fred noticed that he had wet himself, and the two had a good laugh. But the situation was becoming critical. Drinking water was no longer an issue due to the heavy rainfall, but food was, and the construction was moving closer and closer to their new dugout. Then, on March 9th, while foraging for the last few morsels of food, Scotty stumbled upon American POW Ted Hensel. He was aghast when he saw the ragged, unshaven ghosts who stood before him. "We all thought you were dead!" Hensel pleaded with the men to surrender. "The Japanese will treat you well." The long hiding had taken a heavy physical and psychological toll on the men. They were tired of running. Could this really be the end? Scotty said to Fred, "If you want to go in now, I'm with you." And with that, Logan, Scotty K, and Fred Stevens finally surrendered. But their story wasn't over. They were put into prison, accused of being spies, and sentenced to be shot. They began to second-guess themselves. Did we really make the right decision? On the day of their execution, they were served a full-course meal. "I guess this is it, Fred." "I can't believe it, Scotty." But the firing squad never came. Instead, the military high command in Tokyo gave them a stay of execution and shipped them to a prison camp in Sasebo, Japan, where they were held until war's end in 1945. And with that, the two men were finally free. Years later, Scotty would return to Wake Island to retrieve his buried diaries. Their legendary evasion would remain hidden from history until 2006, when their story was published in George Roller's book, First into Nagasaki. To this day, the men are still listed as missing in action, but now we know the truth about Logan, Scotty K, and Fred Stevens, the Robinson Crusoes of Wake Island.